And now we're here with Susan Gordon, who brings yet another perspective into the UFO phenomenon. And with that, Susan, how did you first get involved? I mean, you're in a slightly different area because you're dealing with things on a more psychological basis. What got you involved?
Well, I guess I would go back to 1988 when a friend of mine encouraged me to take a few meditation classes, and that seemed to start the ball rolling. I didn't take classes in meditation in order to become a UFO contactee or anything like that. Up to this point, I knew nothing about UFO contacts or that there was such a thing as investigators or anything. I was in the advertising business, and prior to that I was in the horse business, so I couldn't have been further removed from...
And substance-wise, your life had been clean, so there was no...
Yes, I guess I really feel like an alien because I have not used anything, any mind-altering substances or anything that would have stimulated those processes otherwise, although I do understand that by meditation you can get in touch with the other side, and that certainly is what happened, and it began a long series of events that eventually led me into the UFO field full-time.
Now, we first met at a UFO conference several years ago.
That's right, that was 2 years ago, this September. I remember.
Wonderful. Now, the perspective that you're taking now, though, from how did you get involved? First of all, would you describe more the skew that you've taken?
All right. I've started looking at things genetically and chemically, processes that take place in the brain that allow these sort of things that I'm referring to are anything from what the medical profession terms as auditory hallucinations to visual hallucinations. Whether they're hallucinations or not, I think they're all very real, for one thing.
Perception is reality.
Perception is reality, that's right, and thought is matter. So it's just a label that's attached to these things, and a lot of people seem to have the same hallucinations, which is rather interesting. But we have to look at how it affects the real world and how people outside of ufology, deal with things like this. And I guess I really started using myself as a guinea pig and finding out why this happened, and I discovered that things occurred when I was a teenager that were probably quite pertinent to what started happening when I was 28 and I had taken those meditation classes, and everything that led to a series of contacts and writings and all kinds of things, you know, that typically happen when someone becomes a UFO contactee, quote unquote. And I started looking at a real practical sense, encouraged by the fact that I live with a scientist who demands hardcore evidence of things, which was actually very good because I had done the New Age.
Grounded.
It did. I had done the New Age metaphysical thing. I started working with crystals and started to understand and found a lot of success in working with crystals, especially with animals, which, you know, I'd been a horse trainer for a number of years and was able to see the results and the effects of actually...
At an equestrian level, right?
At a professional level. I was, up and with jumpers and the Olympic disciplines. So I was into that full time. And I guess I just went from there into various sciences, and I would have to say that I was led into things because although I'd wanted to be a scientist when I was a kid, zoology was my thing, and the microscope was my favorite toy, and I just never had really done that once I got out of high school. So I became interested again in things like electronics and engineering and started studying that, and that led to the study of superconducting materials, and then I looked around and realized that a very big problem was with substance abuse and chemical addictions, and started looking at that, and then discovered molecular psychology and started seeing the connections with the whole extraterrestrial and UFO phenomenon. Then I started looking at genetics because, you know, I'd heard speakers talk about alleged genetic manipulations by aliens and the conspiracies and the cover-ups, and one thing has led to another, and I found some...
Is it more a process of actual natural selection?
What's that? The process by which I've looked into all of these various sciences, or the way...
The way that people are becoming open to these types of experiences, the awareness that they're there.
I think what we are actually seeing, from what I have gathered through medical journals, and I do have access to updated medical journals. I volunteer in the I volunteer in the staff library at the Mayo Clinic, which is a very I feel very fortunate to be able to do such a thing. But I do a lot of reading.
Get to be privy to that kind of information.
No, and I really did want to look into really specific medical information and select areas of research and study that I was really getting frustrated with in regular libraries, and starting to look into databases and things like that, and just find out where I can access more specific information. But I think, and from what I've gathered, is that we are actually undergoing some kind of evolution in our central nervous system. And it's becoming more and more on a group level, where we are seeing people get in touch with what has normally been outside of our visible spectrum. Things like orgone energy, or UFOs as unicellular bioplasmic entities, which is an interesting concept as well.
It's an interesting term. Could you explain that?
That is, what it comes down to is we are literally living in the microcosm of a gigantic plasma field, where this planet is really not that much different from the cells that course through the veins in our very own bodies. And when you look at
that smacks of oneness.
You bet it does. That's it. And what it comes down to is an explanation of life. If we're to understand the whole UFO and extraterrestrial phenomena, we have to understand life, which unfortunately over the years has become separated into the arts or certain sciences, and nobody's really gotten together and unified everything.
Yeah, they've all gotten into specific specializations.
That's right.
It's like doctors going to
and they all
school.
battle
okay,
with
what are you
each
going to
other.
specialize in?
That's right.
And they go this way and that way.
And they're stuck there for years, and they end up with a very narrow view unless they are some kind of visionary, which all through history the greatest leaders and inventors have been a combination of many things, and generally studied many different sciences, and involved themselves in as many different things as they possibly could in order to understand their world and their environment. And we really do have to have a sophisticated knowledge of all different aspects in order to understand the UFO phenomena. And understanding that we are part of a huge plasma field is just part of it, and it all makes sense after a while.
Takes a while.
Yes.
The specific study that you've been doing has been more into the specifics of substance abuse, chemical stimulation,
That's right.
from the foods that we eat and the products that we put into our bodies. What have you found in that?
A lot. There are chemicals that are becoming very popular, like the artificial sweeteners and things that are known not only very toxic to the human body, but they actually cause alterations at the level of the gene expression, so that thoughts become disordered. The whole process that goes from the gene to the enzyme to the molecule to the thought becomes defective. And we're seeing a really...
So the electrochemical neurocircuitry breaks down.
That's right. That's right. It just malfunctions. It has a lot to do with understanding basic brain chemistry and how neural circuitry works. But essentially, if the gene has been tampered with and it's altered, then that entire chain, right, to the thought and the reaction is defective. And what seems to be happening is that large groups of people, for example, I'll pick on manic depression or bipolar affective disorder, including its milder forms, it said that it's going to affect up to 30% of the population, where people will suddenly become very, well, if the first episode is manic, they can become extremely hostile and violent and just do...
Well, it seems like you walk down the street in any city, in any location, even in the small towns, people are manic depressive.
It's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's alarming, and if you talk to a pharmacist or a doctor that's involved with it, or you go into the professional community where there are psychologists working with younger people especially, because it often starts in the teenage years. And it's very, very frightening. And it seems that a lot of these people all of a sudden start doing things that in the metaphysical community are considered wonderful, like they start channeling music, or they start talking to angels, or they start seeing UFOs. And it seems to correlate
with... But is that good
with
for them?
In this case, it isn't. It seems to throw them completely off balance, and then especially if it's been chemically triggered. by these substances, like poisonous substances in the food, like NutraSweet, which is so toxic and has been known to, it is a known trigger for this illness, as is cocaine, for example. Anything that seems to cause violent mood or personality swings, it's my personal feeling that this puts people in danger of these, and I believe it's driven, I mean, if you want to go back and you can look at the whole idea of these gray aliens being fallen angels, the Luciferic beings who would prefer that mankind not evolve, remain as spiritual automatons instead of gaining spiritual freedom, and it's all of these substances that take away the free will of the person that has used them. And it seems that even if there's a pre-existing genetic condition, for example, if someone's the child of an alcoholic, you are known to have a condition that exists in the brain that actually registers on an EEG as a missing brainwave pattern called P3. And I think sometimes in the case of manic depression even that seems to be the only common link, and substance abuse is very common amongst those with the manic depression too. And like I mentioned, cocaine is a known trigger.
You also mentioned NutraSweet.
Which happens to be made by the same company that manufactures Prozac, which is a drug that is used in cases of depression and manic depression. It's very controversial.
So you're saying that the same company that produces the chemical that causes the disease also produces the chemical
that
treats the disease.
Yes.
That sounds like a hell of a money-making proposition.
Doesn't it? I mean, it kind of takes it out of the context of, okay, so the government has UFOs, and there's all this stuff going on about the conspiracies and the cover-ups, and I think people are missing what is really happening.
Well, one of the oldest
Chinese
philosophies is to divide the enemy and let them fight amongst themselves.
Sure. Which is exactly what's happening. And as far as, you know, chemical, electrochemical, I mean, I use the term psychogenetic engineering a lot. Because when the gene is pinpointed, a gene that causes, I mean, our laboratories, they say in the profession that, you know, this is all being researched now, it's all being discovered. Well, you can bet in some lab, which all of the major universities in the research are monitored by the CIA in this country, which, of course, don't have to release anything to the general public.
Which is scary when you know that George Bush used to be the head of the CIA.
Of course. And all of this technology is not alien technology. Who knows, maybe some extraterrestrial started it in some lab a long time ago, but it is certainly known to the labs and to the researchers and to the scientists on this planet, the ones that are working with it, the ones that are releasing it. And you can bet the stuff that gets released to the public has been in the works and known long before it ever gets into the public sector. And
marginalized information, so to speak.
Yeah, sure it is. So psychogenetic engineering is not beyond the capabilities of what goes on this planet right now. I mean, we have machines that if a photon in your brain moves, these machines will register it. I'm talking about a SQUID or, you know, an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, which is something that actually alters, it works off what's called the resting rate of hydrogen atoms in the body. And we can actually do, you know, see inside a person's head. Well, it's still alive.
There's been articles in the major papers here, I'm guessing about 6 months ago, regarding MRI.
Sure. It's, there's still a lot that's unknown about it. Even with functional brain scanning or brain mapping, you know, people are saying now, is it a useful tool or a dangerous toy? Because these instruments are now in the hands of a lot of uncertified people. And who knows what's going to come out of that.
Same thing with television, I suppose, eh?
The television's in the hands of a lot of uncertified people.
Who?
What are they doing over those airwaves? But there's a lot going on that, you know, people are so quick to say, oh, the extraterrestrials brought this in or the aliens brought this in, and they are missing the fact that there are a lot of people...
Aren't we responsible?
We are responsible, bottom line. There's a lot of people in a lot of trouble, and it is getting worse every day, and anyone that's working in the industry, in the medical profession, or in counseling, or especially working with young people, they are really feeling that there is some kind of crisis. When I hear people saying, oh, these earth changes are coming up, or so-and-so channel this in 1992 and 1995 are going to be this and that, and I just sit there and go, like, just look at where the problem is. 43% of Americans, for example, are affected by alcoholism, one way or the other. It is absolutely devastating. It is usually the underlying problem between half the people in prison, 25% of all hospital cases. That's from a book called, I believe it's called Alcohol in America, which is an excellent book. And it might be even higher than that. And it's absolutely devastating. really devastating. If there is a crisis in the human mind right now, which I believe is where things like, this photon belt and all of this stuff that came up, and although people laughed at it and said it was a joke, to me it indicates that something is definitely going on. When people start spreading this around and other people start believing it, there is definitely a crisis happening.
Well, especially when you achieve, like we were talking earlier, a mass critical consciousness.
Yeah.
That enables something to happen, whether we consciously accept the responsibility for that or not.
And
that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen.
That's right.
It's like just because you don't believe something doesn't mean it's not true.
Yeah. And I actually use the word believe very little now, because you can know one way or the other. You can do enough research, even if it's finding out what goes on between, life and rebirth, if you want. You can find scientific, you can look into physics, you can look into chemistry, you can look at anthroposophy, and you can find out exactly what happens with very logical explanations, not just saying, the energy is this or the vibration is this. There is always some way to get some kind of concrete fact. And in spiritual science, which I have to consider ufology being, in one aspect, spiritual science, even more so than mechanistic science, I think you have to endeavor to find concrete facts. Generalizations and abstractions aren't good enough. If somebody's talking energy, then they darn well better have a physical explanation of what energy means, what vibration or vibratory rate means. If they're talking about light, they're talking about wavelengths and nanometers. Are they talking particles or wave fields? And you kind of have to flip-flop back and forth, because, again, there isn't really a tightly knit community that really does combine all of these things totally, although there are some very good groups out there.
How can someone who is questioning these things, how can they rely on what's going on inside of them?
That's another interesting point, because I think more than ever it's really important to, like I mentioned earlier this morning, to maintain our sanity. And in order to do that, you have to know what is going on in the world around you, as far as what is creating just the opposite. And in order to stay focused and really know what's happening with your body, for example, people that are fatigued or having environmental allergies, just generally feeling unwell, or that they're in the wrong place, or that something's not happening.
Like the chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yes.
That the majority, it's even stated medically that it's been proven that the majority of people in the United States suffer from chronic fatigue syndrome.
Oh, and I believe it. And the only way we're going to get around that is to learn how our body works, like how it really works, and understand how the energy system works. And I think our future is in non-invasive medicine, for one thing. And really, from what I've found and from what I've put into practice recently, is that light, for one thing, is a very practical thing to actually work with. Full spectrum lighting, which helps keep the body balanced. It's actually been approved by the National Institute of Mental Health now in the treatment of, I believe it's 6 or 7 different mental disorders that have been divided up into, and the full spectrum light boxes have been approved for treatment, to be covered by insurance and everything. In the
so
case
we are
of
making
depression,
strides then.
We are. We actually are. And when I see things like that happen, I go, all right, there is hope. There are good things. Because I don't mean to sound like all doom and gloom, everything is not terrible, but we have to be aware that this is happening to large groups of people on a large scale, and we must somehow be aware of which substances take away our free will, which includes anything that is mood and mind altering at this point, puts you in touch with the group consciousness that surrounds that substance. In the most part, it's pretty bad at this point. It's pretty bad.
Susan?
So.
Thank you. So
You're welcome.
So we said, in essence, that we need to know what is.
We do, and what we can do.
I am your door.